welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen. And today I am joined by a researcher and writer, a historian, somebody who wears many hats and has written an absolutely fascinating book. I am so excited to talk about this book, so let's welcome our guest. Hello, could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hello, my name is Surekha Davies, and I've just written a book called Humans, a Monstrous History. And I'm a historian of science, art, and ideas.
Thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited to talk about the book. But before we do, could you tell us a little bit about your career and your research? I'm wondering if you could touch on being a monster consultant, because that's the coolest job title I've ever heard.
Sure. Before I became a history professor, I worked as a curator at the British Library, the Map Library. And that's where I did my PhD dissertation. You know, I was a half-time curator and then worked on the dissertation, which was about European maps of the 16th, 17th centuries and the ways in which the kind of Renaissance idea of the human was shaped by voyages of exploration and, you know, travelers writing about whether or not they had found monstrous peoples at the so-called edges of the earth. So that's kind of one of the places really where my career as a historian began. It was as a curator rather than as an academic. And then I became a history professor. And after that, after I got tenure, I continued to be a researcher. And then I started to think about writing for a general audience. You know, I took a job that was fewer days a week, still as a historian, and had a go at, seeing if I could get an agent and a book deal. And this I did, and then I became a full-time commercial nonfiction author. And one of the things I've just begun to do, I've done it, 2 or 3 times, is to have conversations with people who produce or are the early stages of developing documentary type stuff for TV and also fictional things, TV series. So that's something I hope I will be doing, more of in the future. But what I am most of all is an author and a speaker. And this second book, Humans, a Monstrous History, comes out of that, first dissertation project of, working on the history of exploration. And then I was actually finishing that manuscript up in the Library of Congress when I realized that there was a bigger book that needed to be written at some point in the future that really showed how even to understand, science and economics and the ways in which astrobiologists, for example, some of whom were gathered at the Library of Congress when I was there, cannot really prepare for something as extraordinary as encountering extraterrestrial life without looking at how societies have already, reacted to encountering forms of life and societies they weren't expecting.
I'm really glad that you brought up the astrobiology conference because that story opens your first chapter. And I was really interested in the way that, space is sort of threaded throughout the book in various examples. I read that you are a Star Trek fan, and I am too. And
Great.
you talk about it a lot. You talk about TNG and DS9. So that brings me to a broader question about your sources and your examples. By the standards of history, if you were to compare it to an academic history, it's a slimish volume and it tackles so much time and so many topics and so many sources. What was your approach to organizing all that material and filtering your sources? Because I imagine that there's just so much stuff that you can choose to talk about that it really must feel like killing your darling sometimes to have to decide what to leave out.
Uh-huh. Certainly. Lots of great questions. I will start by saying it's definitely not a slim volume. I mean, there are academic books that are, that are bigger. My own first book is bigger, but it's also more words than a number of academic books. So I'd say it's kind of very kind of average for a history book length. It's 115,000 words or some such. I think 100,000 is more like a commercial author's book. But history books are all kinds of sizes. And yet it is slimish for the range of the things, the range of the centuries and places that it touches upon. My examples go from antiquity, from the Gilgamesh epic that's several thousand years old, up to the present day. There are, a lot of examples from Europe and the Americas, and also some examples from Africa, Asia, the kind of Pacific. And so it's a tiny volume for that range of material. And yet, how long a book might someone realistically read from beginning to end? So this is a book that had, more and more dilemmas about structure and choices. The closer I got to thinking it's got to be done and I've got to move on, like a locust moving from half-eaten field to half-eaten field. And I guess at the start, I had a fairly modest idea about the range. And the very first title in my head was Before Frankenstein, A History of Europe Through Monsters. So it was very narrow, and it was a story about how people in Europe had thought about what it means to be human constantly in relation to this fuzzy idea of the monster. And I was going to go up to Frankenstein and then say, oh, and by the way, this is really relevant for the present. And then pretty soon I thought, well, why am I missing 2 centuries out then? So, this person who'd not really, done any research beyond 1800 reluctantly started to think about the modern era and found that to actually be a comfortable place to go if you had a tight theme, which was the category of the monster. And by that I mean, anywhere you have categories, wolves, people, corpses, machines, you theoretically also have monsters in that classification system, because what happens if you cross a wolf with a person? If you think of those as separate categories, whether werewolves exist or not, that is the category of monstrosity. And equally, cyborgs, Frankenstein's monster is a monster because he crosses that boundary between dead and alive. His body's made up of corpses from a lot of different people. So again, where's the boundary between an individual human and another? So since I was interested in how people defined what it means to be human in relation to a whole bunch of other categories like animals and machines and extraterrestrials, and right where that boundary is between, say, human and machine, that's where you have words, labels for those beings that break those categories, that show that those categories are actually living on a continuum. So the cyborg, for example. And then there's a question of, okay, so I'm going to cover lots of centuries. And of course, for my first book, I had to look at ancient Greece and Rome to trace how people in 16th century Europe were making sense of the New World, because they were doing that through those ancient texts. So I had this kind of body of homework I'd done for a previous book. And then the question was, Am I going to cover examples from around the world in a fairly kind of even quantity, continent by continent, or not? And it seemed to me that any kind of question of coverage in a slim volume for given the whole world was never actually going to be thorough anyway. What was I going to cover? Have like one monster per 100 square miles? It wasn't really feasible. And then I thought, well, what might make a good story? And I realized that I wanted some kind of through line rather than to write a monster encyclopedia or a telephone book or a monster wiki. So it really was this battle between telling something that was a story with chapter by chapter a different theme, how we thought about the human in relation to machines or in relation to animals, and also showing the variety and the alternative ways of thinking about monsters in different parts of the world. But, each chapter could have been a book of its own. And so I tried to select examples that resonated for me. And then I thought I might have something to say that will resonate with readers who can then go off and see monsters everywhere.
That's lovely. And I really did love the structure and the way that each story sort of has its own narrative arc, as it were, while also contributing to the wider arc of the entire book. So let's talk about what your argument is in those chapters. You talk about monsters, but you also talk about the process of monstrification. So could you tell us what that is? And, this is asking you to summarize the whole book, but why we make monsters, why we indulge in monstrification.
Ah, sure. So one of the kind of contentious things I say in the introduction is there are no monsters and all of them are real. And what I mean by that is, and I'll start with the real part, monstrification, I argue, is a process. So people go through this process of observing the world, thinking about it, and defining all the things as categories. I don't know, food, poison, anteater, human being. And the idea that there are categories and then like problem examples, that comes out of any classificatory system. And monstrification is this process of labeling something as not fitting categories because they're straddling categories rather than being tightly in one, or in some way failing to be normal. But those are stories that people tell, and someone with kind of one set of values and a particular worldview may see some other person as challenging what they think of as normal definitions of normal people in the world. But someone else might find this supposed category breaker to be kind of completely fine and welcome. And maybe a utopian example of that would be The Muppet Show. And yes, my scope ranges from really serious things like, Aristotle and the ancient Greeks to The Muppet Show. And there, each of those Muppets is kind of different. Many of them seem like human animal hybrids. I mean, what is Gonzo even? Probably a kind of turkey crossed with a person. And, they're all kind of individual, and they all kind of belong. So monstrification is a kind of storytelling, and people tell on themselves through the stories they tell about monsters, and as to why. Let me kind of pretend I'm a psychoanalyst for a minute and say, um, you know, people seem to often be worried about how stable they are as beings, as identities, as people, and whether they are nice and tidily separate from other beings or animals or not. And this is not, I'm not saying that every single person is frightened of being on a continuum, but I think that that urge to make monsters, it's not simply about saying, oh, look, there's a person or a being over there who's totally different. Nobody worries about wolves, but they don't worry about werewolves, because then where I end as a human is no longer so straightforwardly separate from a wolf, and I might wonder whether I might turn into one of those. So I think one of the reasons monster making happens, whether it's you know these processes of societies deciding that certain groups don't deserve the same rights or protections, because of their religion, because of their gender, is partly through fear of, really, which is kind of sad, of all the possibilities that are available to them. And it's also something that historically individuals and groups looking to access large amounts of power have consciously told monstrifying stories about who doesn't deserve rights. But then we have kind of fiction in which people write about these kind of scenarios that make us think about the boundaries between aliens and people even. There's some E.T. in which, the extraterrestrial has a psychic connection, to a human boy. And I think through fiction, the authors writing these things and the kind of those of us, consuming them, they allow us to imagine alternate ways of living and interacting.
That's so interesting. And I'm so glad that you brought up both these sort of more you know, imperialist oppressive models of monsters and things like the Muppets or like Star Trek and Data, because you talk about Measure of Man that are almost more
Mm.
aspirational about what we could be as humans, like it's fascinating to me that like I entered the book with this idea that monstrification was going to be a net negative, like always a negative process, but it is sort of like more a neutral tool and it does different things in different hands.
Exactly. Yeah, so sought to kind of cover that kind of range of examples. So sure, people might have a taxonomy of beings in the world, but how they interpret, what it means for someone to be at the boundary between categories, that those things, shape kind of laws and customs and historical trajectories. But it is still kind of neutral. And you can go back and decide, oh well, my categories are incomplete. And in today's kind of biology, people will regularly say, oh look, we found a new species of bat or whatever it is. And once upon a time, the language for that, the word for that, might well have been monster, and it wasn't meant in a threatening way, but rather, oh look, here's something that doesn't fit our categories. But that shift to the phrase new species, in a way, it it reveals a classificatory system which already has room for the things we don't yet know. It's an open structure that doesn't that where there's no risk of people having a meltdown if a new species is found, because sort of we've already allowed for that and realized that our knowledge is contingent and growing. Even with say, kind of fossil discoveries, I mean, we may think we know what human is in geographical space, but in geological time, that's a judgment call, and whether or not that is alarming to people, that's what's not set in stone.
I'd love to talk more about that when it is alarming for people and when you do get these sort of more oppressive utilizations of the category, as it were. Um, I was thinking about your point in the book, but I also maybe think one of the articles of yours I've read that the monsters on the maps in the Age of Exploration were signs of minds being blown, of just like places where there were things that the human mind could not really quite contain yet. So is there always like a little bit of like cosmic horror to that sort of view of the monster, like an existential threat, and how that sort of then gets wrapped up in the narratives that legitimize colonization or oppression and so on.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think my short answer is yes. My kind of medium length answer around the, age of European exploration is that, oops, even my pencil is excited. Um, for, geographers and any kind of vaguely educated, person in the 15th, 16th century, and even, and certainly the centuries before, the human body was seen as kind of malleable. There were these substances, essential substances inside it. The kind of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, red, yellow bile. Got that right? Yes. And the balance of these humors determined your temperament and whether you were sick or well. And these humors were affected by what you ate, even what you did, and the climate around you. And in theory, if you move to a very different climate, your mind and your temperament, your body, would change. And there was also this theory that at the kind of edges of the world, where the climate was very hot or very cold, minds and bodies would be, so denatured that they would be, what, the ancients called monstrous peoples. So entire species, if you will, that were not human in the way that, say people of the Mediterranean were, human. They might have heads in their chests, their faces in their chests and no heads, or eat human flesh. And the existential threat of long distance voyages, southwards, to the far west, was that you might end up in these places where, humanity, such as it was, existed in the form of these monstrous peoples. And kind of even worse, once you're circumnavigating the entire Earth, that does beg the question, where is the boundary between human space and monster space? And what might happen to your colonists? And, once there were, great numbers of European colonists and planters going to, say, the Caribbean, kidnapping, people from the west coast of Africa and taking them to work in plantations. Many of them would get very sick that first year with, the kind of diseases that they weren't used to. A certain number would die, and then they would be less likely to get quite as sick later. So there were these explanations around this notion of seasoning, that your body would adapt. But then that created its own worry. Oh my goodness, my son went off to Barbados, and is he going to be physiologically still completely civilized? Is there an anti-civilizational kind of effect to the New World? And so one of the ways people wrote their way out of this space of cosmic horror is to say that, well, actually, your original bloodline carries with it something with some resistance, and Europeans are more resistant to those climates than you might fear. And they also, wrote stories about how Africans were better suited to laboring in hot climates, which was the one more, stone in that, edifice to justify chattel slavery.
And you do mention in the book that a lot of this is very timely, and I think that what you have just been talking about really illustrates that, is that we have politicians now who argue that some races don't need vaccines because they are more naturally resistant to infection. Can you talk a little bit more about how current divisions in our society are built on these old anxieties that are sort of filtered through the prism of the monster?
Sure. I think, race and gender are two, kind of obvious, flashpoints of the present that have embedded, within those monstrifying stories, kind of very ancient roots. In the kind of historical record, there are, for example, trans people, throughout, many, many centuries. If you look at the documents, so this is not a new phenomenon, and yet it has been a far right talking point for some time, and I am reminded of this firebrand Scottish preacher of the 16th century called John Knox. He was a Protestant and he was super angry that Queen Mary I, Henry VIII's daughter and a Catholic, had, got onto the throne in 1558. And he wrote an angry pamphlet about how this was a monstrous regiment of women. He used the word monster over and over again to say it was appalling that England should have, a woman on the throne, and how this was like it made the country a monstrous birth because it had this wrong head on top. So while his real beef was with the fact that Queen Mary was Catholic, what he activated was a much more widespread prejudice, which was against women. And this is how he tried to encourage the kind of nobles to rebel against her. And we might kind of think of that today with, increasing amounts of hostility and, and the kind of rhetoric against LGBTQI, people. What are the other agendas that, are kind of getting hidden by choosing, these very, very, very small groups of people upon whom to place this kind of fear of moral, meltdown. And, with race as well, how do you define a kind of race or a kind of nation? Races don't exist in biology. The difference between across two so-called races is much smaller than the sheer range of types of people in terms of how we look on the outside within any of those so-called races. And these groups were not hermetically sealed from each other until 50 years ago or 250 years ago. And yet these kind of stories are told that get rewritten over the centuries about who's a full citizen and whose claims are legitimate. I mean, until 1924, the United States as a nation didn't recognize the citizenship of Native Americans. If you were a Native American, you were not a US citizen until 1924. And now again, that citizenship and birthright citizenship, people are retelling stories. And so you can see that monster making process where groups are being storified as no longer belonging and being pushed to that zone, that liminal zone where, they're at the edge of two categories.
It brings me back to to bring it full circle to Star Trek. I'm thinking of the not a catchphrase, but something that's repeated on the show thematically, infinite diversity and infinite combinations, and that could either be a really exciting opportunity to you, or if you are oriented in a slightly different way, a threat. And so I think that it just really gets at, the complexity with which you treat the figure of the monster and this process of monstrification and use it to tell us so much about humans and how we think about ourselves. So thank you so much for coming and sharing this book with our listeners and with me. I've really enjoyed talking about it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. One question before we go. What is next for you? Are you researching anything new, or are you resting between books right now? What are you up to?
Well, there's no rest for the wicked, and I'm already working on the next thing. I would love to, get far enough along to get the next book deal, before, too much time has passed. So, but I'm staying with the strange and the uncanny. That's what it will be. Readers who enjoyed this book will hopefully, see that same kind of like mind-blowing feeling, they'll experience the same kind of mind-blown feeling around, mysteries and classificatory drama, shall we say.
Well, I can't wait. Thank you again so much. This has been really lovely. And for our listeners, this has been Jen in conversation with Dr. Surekha Davis. Thank you so much for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, it's time to close this chapter. We will see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.